June 20th, 1944, a humid dawn aboard USS Enterprise, Philippine Sea. Dragged from the ocean just hours earlier, a Japanese pilot now stood frozen in a mess hall, staring at a tray piled high with fried chicken, butter-soaked potatoes, apple pie, and a glass of milk colder than the water he'd nearly drowned in. The clang of machinery echoed through steel decks, diesel fumes clung to the air, and then came something impossible, the faint sweetness of vanilla. A sailor leaned in and asked, almost casually, chocolate or vanilla? For men taught to expect torture or execution, the offer of dessert was more terrifying than death, because it meant everything they had been told about America was a lie. This was no propaganda trick. This was reality, a reality that would rip apart the very core of Japan's war ideology. Stay with me as we uncover how the first American meal changed Japanese POWs forever. And if you love powerful untold stories of World War II, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and join us for the full story. The steel corridors of USS Enterprise echoed with clanging boots and the steady hum of machinery, but Lieutenant Junior Grade Saburo Kitamura barely registered the sounds. His stomach twisted as he clutched a metal tray heavier than his imagination could bear. On it lay fried chicken glistening with grease, mashed potatoes bathed in melted butter, bright green beans, a slice of apple pie, and a tall glass of cold milk beading with condensation. 4 hours earlier, Kitamura had been pulled from the Philippine Sea after his plane fell from the sky in the Great Clash, later called the Marianas Turkey Shoot. He had expected pain, humiliation, and perhaps death. Instead, he stood staring at abundance. The paradox crystallized in a single question barked from behind the serving line, chocolate or vanilla. The sailor wielding the scoop sounded impatient, as though the choice was obvious. But to Kitamura, it was impossible. Ice cream had no place on warships. The Japanese Navy struggled to provide rice balls and pickled vegetables at sea. How could enemies, supposedly decadent and soft, offer frozen desserts in the middle of a battle? Kitamura's hands trembled. Propaganda at home had painted Americans as monsters, barbarians who tortured captives, who reveled in cruelty, who devoured prisoners like beasts. Japanese cadets were taught to fight to the death rather than fall into enemy hands. To be captured was not only shame but an invitation to torment, and yet, instead of fists or bayonets, he was met with morphine for his wounds, clean bandages for his cuts, and now ice cream flavors. He later admitted this moment never left him. That question, he wrote years after the war, was the beginning of the end of everything I believed. Kitamura was not alone. He was one of 43 Japanese airmen pulled from the water during the battle. Each of them boarded American carriers convinced they were stepping into hell. Each found themselves seated at tables where sailors griped about food that seemed like feasts to men raised on rationed rice. Across the Pacific War, roughly 35,000 Japanese prisoners would encounter such scenes aboard American ships. Their testimonies echoed a common refrain: shock, disbelief, and a growing realization that their empire had lied. The statistics reinforced the sensation. By 1944, Japanese naval crews were receiving about 1,400 calories per day when supplies could be delivered at all. Protein was scarce, vitamin deficiencies were rampant, and diseases like beriberi and scurvy haunted the fleet. Navy records show carrier crews consuming over 4,100 calories daily, drawn from fresh meat, baked bread, vegetables, dairy, and fruit. For the Japanese prisoners, the difference between expectation and reality was measured not in numbers, but in bites of chicken and spoonfuls of ice cream. Petty Officer Kazuo Sakamaki, captured earlier in the war, recalled his disbelief. Your sailors had showers with hot water. They had mattresses, sheets, even books to read. It was like another world. I thought, if this is defeat, what is victory? His words reflected the same disorientation Kitamura felt in that mess hall, the fracture of a worldview when confronted by unshakable evidence. The air smelled of coffee and fried food, the clatter of utensils filling the hall. American sailors laughed and swapped jokes, hardly glancing at the prisoners sharing their tables. Kitamura sat frozen, apple pie untouched, ice cream melting into a sweet puddle he could hardly believe existed. The war was far from over, but for him the myths had already begun to collapse. But this was only the beginning. What the prisoners witnessed next went beyond meals. It stretched into the very core of how nations fought and sustained war, and it revealed a truth more devastating than bombs. America's greatest strength was not merely in weapons but in abundance. The Japanese military machine was built not only on steel and gunpowder, but on stories. For years, recruits were drilled with the same message: Americans were devils. They tortured captives, desecrated bodies, and treated prisoners with less dignity than animals. To be captured was to invite unspeakable horror. This narrative was repeated endlessly in training manuals, propaganda films, and the fiery speeches of officers. It was not merely instruction, it was indoctrination, a firewall meant to keep Japanese men fighting to the death rather than surrender. And yet, aboard American carriers in 1944, this carefully constructed wall crumbled with startling speed. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, recalled his own capture and the profound shock of contradiction. They hauled me up like a fish, and I thought, this is the end. Instead, a courseman examined me gently, and a sailor handed me a cup of hot coffee, real coffee, with sugar and cream. I had not tasted such a thing since 1942. Then he apologized. They had no donuts to offer. Fuchida's later testimony described that apology as more disorienting than enemy fire. The paradox was everywhere. Japanese sailors had been told Americans were weak, soft, incapable of hardship. But here they were, repairing planes between bombing runs, eating roasts and pies, and treating even sworn enemies with medical care and respect. This was not the brutality described in Japanese broadcasts. It was a living refutation. The statistics deepened the blow. By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was stretched to breaking. Supplies were dwindling. Transport ships sunk by the dozens. Reports captured after the war revealed that average rations had fallen to 1,400 calories a day, often little more than rice and pickled vegetables. In contrast, American carriers were documented serving 15,000 meals daily, cycling through menus that included roast beef, fried chicken, ham with pineapple, and fresh bread. Navy mess records from the same year list 4,100 calories per sailor per day, more than triple what Japanese sailors consumed. Prisoners saw the difference in more than numbers. They smelled the baking bread, heard the clatter of trays, and watched sailors complain about food that would have been luxuries back home. Chief Petty Officer Yoshio Yamada, captured after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, wrote secretly in his diary, "They waste more food after one meal than we received in a week." When I asked why, a guard laughed and said, "It's not waste when there's always more." The irony cut deeply. Japan's Yamato spirit taught that discipline and sacrifice could overcome material shortages, that moral strength outweighed steel and supplies. But here was evidence that abundance itself bred resilience. American sailors, far from being softened by comforts, fought harder because they were well-fed, well-rested, and secure in supply. The propaganda could not survive these first-hand experiences. POWs returned home after the war not as broken men but as witnesses to an alternate reality. Their testimonies undermined the state's lies more thoroughly than leaflets ever could. "We were told Americans were demons," remembered Seaman First Class Hiroshi Nakamura. "But they treated my wounds, gave me blankets, and fed me like a guest." It was Japan that deceived us, not America. The collapse of this narrative left many prisoners in a stunned silence. If their leaders had lied about the enemy's cruelty, what else had been false? The sound of laughter in the mess hall, the taste of butter and sugar, the sight of refrigerators humming below deck, these became living arguments against the empire's ideology. And yet, the shock of food and kindness was only the surface. As days turned to weeks, the prisoners began to glimpse the machinery of abundance itself, the hidden engines that allowed a fleet to feed tens of thousands while fighting in the middle of the ocean. What they saw next was not merely paradoxical, it was impossible. The first tray of fried chicken and pie was not an accident of generosity. It was the product of an industrial machine so vast and relentless that Japanese prisoners could hardly believe what they were seeing. For men accustomed to ration bowls of rice and miso, the mess decks of an American carrier felt like stepping into a country-sized restaurant that never closed. Statistics tell part of the story. By 1944, U.S. Navy carriers sustained their crews at over 4,100 calories per day, compared to the Japanese Navy's average of 1,400. But the raw numbers fail to capture the lived experience. Every morning, American sailors woke to eggs, fresh or powdered, bacon sizzling on steel griddles, bread still warm from the oven. On Tuesdays it might be roast beef, Thursdays, fried chicken, Sundays, ham with pineapple glaze, and always the scent of coffee, endlessly replenished from tall urns that never ran dry. Japanese prisoners, stunned into silence, often stared at the trays of food with disbelief. One diary smuggled from USS Iowa noted, "Their kitchen runs without stopping. Machines peel potatoes, slice bread and make ice. They waste more food in one sitting than our entire ship could eat in a week." That waste, as one American guard explained with a shrug, was not a failure but a luxury born of scale. Supply ships arrived weekly, replacing whatever was discarded. The notion of endless replenishment was unthinkable for men whose fleets waited months for shipments that never came. The scale of production bordered on the miraculous. The bakery on USS Enterprise alone turned out 15,000 loaves of bread daily, its steam kettles capable of boiling 300 gallons of soup at once. Butcher shops stored whole beef carcasses in freezers larger than Japanese submarines. Ice machines churned out tons of cubes every day, keeping vegetables crisp and drinks cold in the middle of the Pacific. Japanese sailors, who considered even a handful of fresh produce rare, stared wide-eyed at bins of lettuce, tomatoes, and fruit arriving at sea. The shock extended beyond the mess hall to the very mechanics of feeding a fleet. The evaporators aboard Enterprise could transform 140,000 gallons of seawater into fresh water daily, more than the entire Japanese carrier force combined. With fresh water, dough could be kneaded, vegetables rinsed, sailors bathed, uniforms washed. All luxuries the Imperial Navy could not dream of at sea. The taste of that water alone struck prisoners as an impossible gift. One of the most jarring contrasts was variety itself. While Japanese crews subsisted on the same monotonous meals, rice, pickled radish, perhaps a small portion of dried fish, Americans rotated through dozens of options weekly. Petty Officer Kazuo Sakamaki remembered, every day brought something new: meat, fruit, sweets, even milk. It was as though they lived in peacetime while we starved in war. The paradox deepened with each meal. Japanese officers had preached that scarcity sharpened discipline, that spirit outweighed comfort. Yet here, men who ate steak and ice cream fought with endurance that seemed endless. Their abundance did not weaken them. It sustained them. The evidence sat steaming on every plate. For the prisoners, the sensory assault was overwhelming. The smell of yeast from the bakery, the sound of trays sliding along rails, the taste of butter melting into potatoes, the sight of sailors tossing away food without hesitation. All of it shattered assumptions drilled into them for years. This was not propaganda. This was reality. And among all these marvels, one treat stood out above the rest. It was more than food. It was proof of a civilization's reach, of an industrial miracle afloat in the Pacific. For Japanese sailors, it was the most improbable thing of all: ice cream. For the Japanese prisoners, the discovery of ice cream at sea was not merely a culinary curiosity, it was a revelation. To men who had been taught that America was decadent, weak, and too soft to fight, a frozen dessert in the middle of the Pacific was not just food. It was evidence, proof of something far larger, that the United States could bend even the laws of nature to its will. The scale of it bordered on the absurd. By mid-1945, the U.S. Navy had commissioned entire ice cream barges, floating factories capable of producing 10 gallons every 7 minutes, day and night. The aircraft carrier Lexington reportedly churned out 1,500 gallons per day, enough to serve her crew multiple scoops in the hottest seas. To Japanese prisoners accustomed to lukewarm rice gruel, this was a miracle in a bowl. The sensory details lingered. One POW recalled in his diary, "The cold bit my teeth, the sweet clung to my tongue. I could not believe such a thing was possible here, in the ocean during war." Another wrote simply, "They eat like emperors." For sailors who had once chewed on dried sweet potatoes as a treat, the smooth creaminess of vanilla ice cream was a staggering contrast. Why ice cream? Partly morale. In the sweltering Pacific, sailors longed for something cold, something that tasted like home. Commanders understood this. Admiral Nimitz himself approved the construction of ice cream plants across the fleet, arguing that a scoop of ice cream was as vital to morale as any letter from home. It was a small comfort, but repeated millions of times, it kept men fighting. But for the prisoners, the paradox cut deeper. How could a nation so rich that it fed ice cream to sailors also build ships faster than Japan could sink them? How could a fleet that spared refrigeration space for dessert also carry more aircraft, more bombs, more fuel than they had imagined? What appeared frivolous, a cone of ice cream, was in fact the visible tip of a colossal industrial iceberg. The Japanese Navy's supply chains had collapsed by 1943. Without secure shipping lanes, even basic rice and fish failed to reach crews. Vitamin deficiencies became endemic: beriberi, night blindness, scurvy. Sailors boiled seawater to wash themselves. Desserts were unheard of. Against that backdrop, ice cream seemed like an insult, or a miracle. There was also the sting of humiliation. Propaganda had promised that Americans were soft, unfit for war, slaves to pleasure. Yet these same soft men stormed beaches under fire, fought to the last plane over the Philippine Sea, and buried comrades with stoic silence. Clearly, ice cream had not made them weak. It had not softened their resolve. If anything, it underscored their strength, the ability to provide luxury even in hardship. One POW later admitted during interrogation, "We thought the war was already decided. When we saw the ice cream, we knew Japan could not win. If a country can make such things at sea, how can we resist?" His words echoed a quiet truth. For these prisoners, the sweetness on their tongues carried a bitter aftertaste, the realization of defeat. The paradox was now undeniable. What they had mocked as decadence was, in truth, abundance. What they had called weakness was, in reality, strength, and ice cream, melting, sweet, cold, had become a weapon of persuasion more devastating than any shell or bomb. But ice cream was only one part of the sensory shock. Beyond food, beyond flavor, lay another realm of astonishment. For the Japanese POWs, it came when they were led below decks to bunks, laundries, showers, libraries, and theaters that seemed more like floating cities than warships. What they saw next would strip away the last illusions of superiority. When Japanese prisoners were escorted below decks, their astonishment deepened. Warships, in their imagination, were supposed to be dark steel caverns reeking of oil and sweat, bare spaces where men endured hardship for emperor and duty. Instead, the carriers of the U.S. Navy felt more like small cities afloat, humming with a rhythm of life that blurred the line between war and peace. The first shock was sleep. Rows upon rows of clean bunks stacked in tiers, stretched down compartments cooled by ventilation fans that hummed day and night. Each bunk had a mattress, sheets and blankets washed weekly in industrial laundries that could clean 5 tons of clothing per day. Japanese sailors, used to sleeping on straw mats or cramped wooden boards, sometimes in uniforms stiff with sweat and salt, could hardly comprehend the luxury of a soft bed that smelled faintly of detergent. One POW whispered to a guard, "Your ships are like hotels." The next marvel was hygiene. Hot showers ran endlessly, fed by the 140,000 gallons of fresh water distilled daily by the ship's evaporators. Prisoners stared in disbelief as sailors lined up casually, scrubbing with soap, water cascading over their backs as if it cost nothing. In the Japanese fleet, bathing often meant wiping with seawater rags. On long patrols, men went unwashed for weeks. Here, fresh water flowed as freely as rain. Even the senses rebelled. Instead of the stench of bilge and unwashed bodies, the air smelled faintly of starch, soap, and coffee. The metallic clang of engines was softened by the unexpected, the strains of swing music drifting from loudspeakers, the murmur of conversations in mess halls, the clatter of silverware instead of chopsticks. It was war, yet it felt like something else entirely. Recreation shocked them further. Below decks, sailors lounged in libraries stocked with thousands of books and magazines. Some gathered in movie rooms, where reels from Hollywood played nightly. Charlie Chaplin, Rita Hayworth, newsreels of baseball games back home. Prisoners who glimpsed these screenings later wrote with awe. They laugh during war. They sit in the dark and watch pictures as if no enemy exists. It was a vision utterly alien to men raised on militarist sermons that glorified suffering and denied distraction. The paradox lay in how comfort did not dull fighting spirit. Japanese doctrine insisted that endurance through deprivation forged warriors, yet these Americans with their bunks and showers and movie nights fought ferociously across oceans, never appearing weakened by their comforts. Abundance, not austerity, sustained them. Small details left lasting impressions. A prisoner noted the stacks of fresh uniforms distributed weekly, the barrels of Coca-Cola unloaded at sea, the smell of popcorn during film screenings. Each detail gnawed at the wartime narrative that America was a nation of weak consumers, incapable of sacrifice. Here was sacrifice, but it was paired with a refusal to live poorly, even in war. The diaries of prisoners reveal a deep sense of disorientation. One wrote, "Our leaders told us the Americans lived like animals, yet they live better in war than we do in peace." Another admitted, "I envied them. Their lives seemed free, even here." The shock of freedom expressed itself not just in political terms but in daily comforts, the ability to laugh, to read, to bathe, to choose. The lesson lingered. Comfort was not the opposite of strength, it was its foundation. By providing these amenities, the U.S. Navy ensured its sailors remained healthy, motivated, and loyal. Disease rates on carriers remained a fraction of those on Japanese ships, where dysentery and beriberi spread unchecked. Clean water and good food were not luxuries, they were force multipliers. For the Japanese prisoners, the comforts of these floating cities carried a more personal revelation. If American sailors were treated so well, how would they, as enemies, be treated when injured or sick? The answer awaited them in the carrier's sick bays, where another paradox unfolded. Advanced medicine, not punishment, became their reality. The hum of machinery faded as Japanese prisoners were escorted into the ship's sick bay. What they found there unsettled them more than the meals or the ice cream. Here, in the heart of an enemy carrier, lay rows of clean white beds, cabinets lined with gleaming instruments, and nurses and corpsmen moving briskly under fluorescent light. It looked less like a place of war than a hospital in Tokyo, only larger, brighter, and stocked with medicines they had never seen. The paradox was immediate. These were enemies, captured in battle, yet the doctors treated them not as criminals but as patients. Wounds were cleaned with antiseptic. Infections were countered with sulfur drugs, and in some cases the new miracle medicine penicillin. Few Japanese had ever even heard of it. On American carriers, penicillin was used widely by 1944, saving countless lives from sepsis and pneumonia. A Japanese sailor with a festering leg wound, expecting amputation, instead watched in astonishment as the swelling receded within days. "I thought they were trying to trick me," he later recalled. But the pain was gone. They had healed me. Numbers underscored the scale of mercy. By the end of the war, U.S. Navy ships had performed over 70,000 surgeries at sea, supported by blood banks, X-ray machines, and sterilizers running on diesel power. Carriers carried entire dental clinics. One report notes that USS Enterprise alone filled 2,400 cavities during her deployments. For sailors, health was preserved. For prisoners, it was a revelation their enemy cared for their bodies better than their own commanders had. Contrast sharpened the lesson. Japanese crews relied on rudimentary care, supplies were scarce, sulfur powder was often spread thin, and many ships lacked even anesthetics. Surgeons were forced to operate with little more than sake for pain relief. Infection was rampant, and thousands died not from bullets or shells but from untreated disease. To a prisoner lying on crisp white sheets with a morphine drip, the disparity was unbearable. The sensory details deepened the shock. The sharp smell of alcohol wiped across skin, the cool sting of iodine brushed into wounds, the steady ticking of sterilizers in the corner. These were alien sensations. Prisoners used to the smell of pus and gangrene, the rough sting of untreated injuries, now felt the comfort of cleanliness. One noted, "It smelled of nothing." That was the strange part. No rot, no sickness, only clean. But medicine did more than heal bodies. It eroded certainty. The imperial creed had warned Americans were brutal. They would torture or execute captives. Instead, they bandaged them, fed them broth, and let them rest. To men indoctrinated with visions of cruelty, this kindness felt disorienting, even humiliating. Mercy, in this context, was more powerful than punishment. For the Americans, this was not propaganda. It was policy. Geneva Conventions were drilled into naval training. Doctors swore an oath to treat all wounded, friend or foe. The US knew that such practices boosted morale among its own sailors too. A man who saw his enemy treated fairly believed his own fate would be secure if captured. Humanity was a weapon, and it worked. Yet the paradox reached deeper still. For Japanese soldiers, their own command had often abandoned them. Thousands were left to starve on Pacific islands. Suicide was encouraged over surrender. Medical care, when available, was meager. Now they lay on beds where enemies gave them not only food and water but the newest science of healing. The comparison was devastating. One POW later confessed, "We were told America had no honor, but their doctors had more honor than our generals." The memory of that treatment outlived the war itself. When these men returned to Japan, they carried stories that undermined the myth of American savagery and fed into the reconstruction of a society where science, care, and dignity would take precedence over militarist sacrifice. But as impressive as the sick bays were, they were still only one part of the larger machinery that sustained American dominance. Beyond medicine, another marvel awaited: the floating workshops and supply chains that could repair, replenish, and rebuild a fleet in the middle of the Pacific. For the prisoners, it was yet another blow, proof that America's strength was not just in battle but in endurance. If food, comfort, and medicine revealed the daily abundance of the American fleet, its true miracle lay in what happened when machines broke, fuel tanks ran low, or ships came limping back from battle. For Japanese prisoners, the scale of American repair and resupply was so far beyond their own experience that it seemed like sorcery. They saw it first in the floating workshops, repair ships and mobile dry docks that followed the fleet like shadows. A damaged carrier could steam into an atoll and, within days, have its hull patched, engines overhauled, and elevators realigned. Some dry docks were so vast they could lift a battleship entirely from the sea. By 1945, the US Navy had deployed 17 massive floating dry docks, each a steel cathedral of cranes and welders. To men raised on the slow starvation of the Japanese fleet, which often abandoned crippled ships because dockyards were thousands of miles away, this ability to heal steel seemed impossible. Replenishment at sea struck them harder still. Japanese doctrine assumed that fleets must return to port for fuel and food. Yet aboard American carriers, prisoners watched the choreography of underway replenishment, tankers steaming alongside, fuel hoses snaking across, cargo nets swinging crates of oranges, mail bags, even ice cream freezers onto the decks, all while the ships maintained formation at 12 knots. This was no rare feat. By 1945, the US Navy executed more than 600 replenishment operations each month, keeping entire task forces supplied indefinitely. The numbers were staggering. One fleet oiler could transfer 100,000 barrels of fuel in a single mission. Ammunition ships carried millions of shells, bombs, and torpedoes. Refrigerated cargo ships brought tons of beef, butter, and fresh produce across oceans. The logistics tail was so strong that by 1944, Task Force 58 could remain at sea for months, striking anywhere from the Marshalls to the Marianas without ever returning home. Japanese POWs realized with sinking clarity they had been fighting a force that could never truly be cut off. The sensory evidence was everywhere. The hiss of fuel pumps, the thump of crates onto steel decks, the smell of oranges spilling from cargo nets. Luxuries carried thousands of miles to men still in combat. A prisoner recalled, "I smelled fruit on the ocean. I thought I was dreaming." But the sailors laughed, peeled the skins, and handed me an orange. We had not seen such food in years. And then there was mail. The US Navy moved not just bombs and bread but letters. Every month, millions of letters and packages reached sailors through a system so efficient it rivaled a small nation's postal service. Men could receive birthday cards in the middle of the Philippine Sea, or photographs of newborn children just weeks after birth. Japanese sailors, who often went years without word from home, were stunned. One POW admitted bitterly, "Our fleet starved for rice. Their fleet delivered cake from mothers." The paradox cut like steel. Where Japan's war machine shrank with every month, America's grew. Where Japanese ships fought hungry and undersupplied, American sailors fought well-fed, freshly clothed, and carrying letters from home. Comfort and connection did not weaken morale, they fortified it. For the prisoners, the realization was crushing. Victory in battle might be fleeting, but victory in logistics was permanent. They understood now, even if they fought bravely, even if they destroyed ships, America could replace, repair, and resupply faster than Japan could respond. The war was, in essence, already decided. And yet, the story did not end with despair. When the war finally ended and these men returned home, they carried more than memories of defeat. They carried lessons, visions of abundance, efficiency, and humanity that would help shape the rebuilding of Japan itself. Their reckoning would become their legacy. By the war's end in August 1945, the guns fell silent, but the memories Japanese prisoners carried back across the Pacific were louder than any battle. They had come as warriors, convinced of their empire's superiority, but they returned as witnesses to a civilization whose strength was measured not merely in weapons but in the abundance of daily life. The paradox was impossible to ignore. Japan had built its military doctrine on the Yamato spirit, the belief that sacrifice, endurance, and spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. But in the mess halls of American carriers, in the ice cream lines during combat alerts, in the steaming laundry rooms and bustling movie theaters, that belief had dissolved. As one prisoner later confessed, "We thought spirit could defeat steel, but their abundance made their steel unbreakable. We thought spirit could defeat steel." Every detail reinforced this new truth. The numbers were stark. US Navy sailors consumed 4,100 calories a day, while Japanese sailors often starved on 1,400. American carriers produced 140,000 gallons of fresh water daily, while Japanese crews went weeks without bathing. The USS Enterprise alone baked 15,000 loaves of bread each day, while Japanese destroyers rationed moldy rice, and perhaps most symbolically, America's fleet made 500 gallons of ice cream daily at sea, even as Japan's men chewed boiled leather to survive. The witness voices became living contradictions of propaganda. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had once orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, described his astonishment at being offered coffee aboard the USS Missouri, complete with cream and sugar. Chief Petty Officer Yoshio Yamada recalled the endless trays of food aboard USS Iowa, more than his destroyer had seen in weeks. Lieutenant Commander Tishi Mieta spoke of enlisted Americans who lived better than Japanese admirals. Their words carried a weight no American broadcast could match. And when these men returned home, their testimony spread like wildfire. They told neighbors and families about ships with soda fountains and libraries, about Christmas dinners served in the middle of war zones, about doctors who treated even prisoners with the same antibiotics given to American boys. In villages where hunger and disease still stalked daily life, these stories sounded like tales from another planet, yet they were true. The impact went beyond memory. It prepared Japan for transformation. When the occupation began, the Japanese public had already been primed, not by propaganda, but by the voices of their own captured sons. They had seen that America's strength came not from cruelty but from capacity, not from deprivation but from logistics, not from tyranny, but from a democracy capable of feeding and supplying millions, even in battle. One prisoner put it simply, "They treated us as humans, even when we were enemies. That is why we could trust them when we lost." The paradox of kindness in the midst of total war dismantled the mythology of hatred. It opened the door to reconciliation. From these shattered illusions came an unlikely legacy. Former enemies became allies. Japan, once a militarist empire built on scarcity and sacrifice, remade itself into a democracy fueled by productivity, technology, and abundance. Men who had tasted their first hamburger or apple pie aboard American carriers would live to see their grandchildren grow up in a nation where such foods, once symbols of defeat, became everyday staples. They had come as conquerors. They left as students. Their lesson was profound, that abundance sustains courage, that kindness undermines cruelty, and that a free nation's greatest weapon is not fear but plenty. In the end, it was not the bombs that most completely dismantled Japanese militarism, but the soft-serve machines that kept running while ships burned, the bread ovens that worked through the night, and the mailbags that carried love across oceans. These things revealed a truth no battlefield could hide. America's greatest strength was never just its arsenal. It was its ability to create, to provide, and to share, even with those who had sworn to die fighting it. This was the victory that mattered most.